And we are back. Welcome back to BlockDown 2020. Our next speaker is a Bitcoin educator, developer, and an entrepreneur. For the majority of his 20-year programming career, he has worked as a software developer for a wide array of companies in different fields. He began exploring Bitcoin all the way back in 2011 and was contributing to open source Bitcoin projects by 2013. In 2014, he joined Montaz, where he led the development of Bitcoin integration with open transactions. After developing a Bitcoin wallet for Armory Technologies, he became the principal architect at Paxos. In 2018, he joined Blockchain Capital as a venture partner. In addition, he runs Programming Blockchain, a company that trains students around the world in blockchain programming and development techniques. The title of his talk today is How Bitcoin Changes Incentives. Please put your virtual hands together for the one, the only, Jimmy Sung. Nice to see you, pal. How are you?
I am great. I'm excited to give this talk. Thank you for having me.
Fantastic. Take it away. It's all yours.
Okay. Can everyone see my screen? Is that okay? Yeah, I guess you guys can see it now. All right. So my talk is called How Bitcoin Changes Incentives. And just to put if there's one thing that you learn from this talk, it's that Bitcoin fixes a lot of stuff. And we're going to talk about how all of that stuff gets fixed. But first, we need to sort of lay out the problem and look at the incentives at various levels. We're going to look at incentives from the individual level and then the company level. Like it or not, that's more or less how we're organized now in society. It's at the individual level, and then we're grouped into companies. It used to be something more like tribes. And then at the level of nations, and finally at the global level. And these are sort of different groupings and how Bitcoin changes the incentives at each level. All right, so let's start with the individual level. The first thing to understand about the individual level is that there are no easy ways to store value in the world today. And what I mean by that is that there's no good way to make sure that you're not losing money versus the monetary expansion that's going on all throughout the world. Just as a point of illustration, you can see with these statistics exactly what's happening. This is the US dollar. This is the M2 money supply of the US dollar. And this includes all time deposits and near money, as they say. They've been keeping this stat since 1959, and the M2 money in US dollars in 1959 was $286.6 billion. The last I checked, about a week ago, the M2 money supply in US dollars as of end of March 2020 was $16.7 trillion. Now, if you calculate that, that's a 5,800% increase over 61 years. And if you annualize that, that ends up being about 6.9% per year that the US dollar has been increasing. This is very different than what is typically thought to be inflation, which is calculated with something called the CPI, or the Consumer Price Index, which is the purchasing power of money. We're talking instead about the monetary expansion of money. As a note, just in the week of March 23rd, 2020, in that 1 week, the Fed or the M2 money supply increased by $370 billion, which is amusing since that's more than the entire M2 money supply in 1959. So you can see that the money constantly expands. And in order to keep up with that, you have a few options, but they're not that great. You have something like real estate, you have stocks, and you have gold. And all of these things more or less just barely keep up with the monetary expansion. For example, the Dow Jones Index since 1959 has gotten about a 6.7% return, which is actually less than the 6.9% annualized increase in the monetary expansion. Real estate generally gets about 5%, and gold is manipulated. But all of these things have a huge transaction costs. Anyone that's bought or sold real estate knows that To buy real estate, you have to pay something like 5% commission. With stocks, you also have to pay commission and so on. Now, what does this incentivize? Well, at the individual level, this incentivizes a lot more effort on storing rather than creating. Anyone that knows anybody that is rich knows that they spend an inordinate amount of time on research. If you are buying real estate, for example, you have to research the actual property, all of the things about the property. You have to get an inspection. You have to know what the school district is like, where the nearest highway is, where the convenient grocery stores are, what the traffic is like. There's a billion things that you have to know about each and every one. And it's kind of wasted effort in many ways because it's not research that anyone else is going to use. They're going to do their own before they do that. And if you're going to do the same, if you're going to invest in stocks, you have to like look at PE ratios, the market competitors, the regulations, all sorts of things that you have to learn about in order to uh, invest money in those things. And that's what you have to do, and it's something that you're forced to do. And these are often the people that were very successful entrepreneurs. They have to expend all of this energy on storing rather than creating. Now, the other option, if you don't like doing all of that research, is this: you really don't need a store of value if there is no value. If you're spending money and just sort of doing whatever you want, then you don't have to deal with the headache of researching stocks or real estate or anything like that. And that's what a lot of people opt to do, and that in turn leads to a lot of this: asset inflation, materialism, and consumption. Now, you might not know all of the things that are in this slide, but the first one is a New York taxi cab medallion, which is issued by the New York Taxi and Limousine Commission. Essentially, they control the supply of taxi cab medallions. Now, this has utility. If you have one of these, you have the right to drive a cab in New York City. Until Uber came along, these medallions were selling for about $2 million each. And why is that? Because it had a store of value premium on it. People weren't buying them so they'd have the right to ride cabs around. It was because they knew that these were scarce and this was a good place to park your money. The second one is a Michael Jordan Fleer rookie card. Again, this costs a lot of money in part because people are storing value in it. It has utility for people that like Michael Jordan and want to own a piece of history or something like that. But largely, it's going to people that are trying to store value. Same thing with the last one. That's a Rothko painting. A lot of people use modern art as a way to store value instead of for decoration or enjoyment or whatever. So all assets take on this sort of store of value property, as I like to say. When nothing is a good store of value, everything to some degree takes on a store of value property. And instead of things being utilized for their usefulness or for their utility, they take on a store of value premium. I'm told that in New York, something like 2/3 of all condos sit kind of empty because they're being used as stores of value by people that don't need them, that are using it just to store value there. Now, another thing that happens as a result of there being no good store of value is that there is rampant materialism. These are two things that you see. There are a Chanel handbag and a Bugatti car. The Chanel handbag, it has a chain made out of diamonds, so it's I believe the cost of that handbag is like $100,000. Now, 20 years ago, a handbag that cost a few $1,000s was considered excessive. Now, a handbag that's $100,000 is considered a little excessive, but it's still like kind of okay, apparently. Similar thing with the Bugatti car. That one is a $10 million car. 20 years ago, $300,000 or $500,000 car was considered very excessive. Now it's gone up. People tend to spend money rather than store money when it becomes like a headache. And finally, consumption. Instead of just spending money on or trying to store value, what you end up doing is consuming a lot of stuff. That last picture is of a rapper that's eating a gold leaf covered donut, and that gold leaf covered donut, if I'm not mistaken, costs $1,000, and that's what he's eating, and that's kind of what ends up happening when you have a lot of money and don't want to bother trying to store it, which is a bit of a headache. As a result, at the individual level in the current system, there's a real emphasis on survival and not entrepreneurship. And it's not hard to know exactly why that is. It's because the money printer has been going burr for a very long time, for 60 plus years at least, probably as long as fiat money has existed. The money printer has been going burr. And it's the emphasis on survival means that there's less emphasis on entrepreneurship. There aren't as many people trying to figure out what good ways that they can contribute to society by providing goods and services at a lower cost or in some way better than something else. So, how does Bitcoin change the incentives here? Well, first of all, the store of value, there is an easy store of value. It's called Bitcoin, and that means that instead of having all of the friction and transaction costs of stocks or real estate or even physical gold, you have something that's essentially fungible and easy to go and get. And instead of spending a lot of effort researching, all that effort can go into creating and into entrepreneurship. It's amazing that a Bitcoin is the same whether or not you're a Silicon Valley insider or a farmer in Bangladesh. It doesn't matter. You essentially can have the same Bitcoin, and you don't need any insider info to get an edge. And that in turn leads to less asset inflation. Things go down to more of their utility value instead of having a store value premium. There's less materialism and less consumption, all good things. And instead of an emphasis on survival, there's an emphasis more on entrepreneurship because people are more focused on trying to make money instead of keeping the money that they have. So that's at the individual level. Let's move up a level to the company level because like it or not, that's how more or less we're organized in society today. Is that you belong to a company and not a tribe. So let's talk about different companies and how that changes things. So first of all, we have to recognize that there is a Cantillon effect. Richard Cantillon was an economist from the early 18th century, shortly after the Bank of England broke new ground with fiat money and central banking. Essentially, the Cantillon, what he noticed was that the first spenders of newly created money get all of the benefits, and the last spenders get none of them. So the thing to realize here is that whenever the Fed goes burr, and whenever central banks go burr, whenever there's new money printed, a lot of that money goes through commercial banks to big companies. That's who the first spenders of that money are. And they are the ones that benefit a lot. And they have an unfair advantage over everybody else. And this, in turn, means that they get to have a lot of debt fueled growth, an insane amount of debt fueled growth. And as a matter of fact, you'll notice that most companies tend to be fairly large for that reason. Now, what can you do when you have access to very cheap loans like most of these companies have? Well, you can do a bunch of things. First of all, you can underprice the competition. This is what I would call the Walmart or Amazon strategy. You can underprice everybody else and use the debt to make things cheaper and cheaper so that you can have a monopoly as a result of being able to underprice everybody else. Another thing that you can do is you can pluck talent from and get the best of the best and pay a premium for all of them. This is what I would call the Facebook or Google strategy. They pay a premium for everybody else because they can. They have access to capital markets, and they can essentially use that capital to get the best talent and withhold them from everybody else. Another one is lobbying. You can lobby governments to create regulatory moats around your business. And if you're a small business, you absolutely do not. It does not make sense to do any sort of lobbying. But after a certain size, lobbying makes all the sense in the world. And finally, if worse comes to worse and you can't do any of those things, you can either buy out your competitors, or as we've learned in the airline industry, you can buy back your own stock with the debt that you can get. And in fact, this is what CEOs have been doing to enhance their stock options and make millions of dollars at the expense of everybody else. So debt fueled growth essentially causes giant companies, and this means that it's a winner take all economy. Now, I put a picture of a unicorn there because a unicorn, at least in Silicon Valley parlance, means a company that is worth more than $1 billion or it has a market cap of over $1 billion. And the reason why I say that is because VCs aren't stupid. They know that you need to get to a certain size before you start to matter, before you start to get some of the inherent advantages of size in a fiat-based economy. And that in turn means that there's less competition. You have to be a big size in order to compete against the companies that exist because they have so many incumbent advantages as a result of being gigantic. And finally, that means that there's an emphasis on size and not innovation. And I like this cartoon, and you can take a moment to appreciate its brilliance. But essentially, what companies do now is they are focused almost entirely on getting the most out of their people, or in running giant organizations which are completely unwieldy, rather than actually innovating anything or bringing new things to market. And this is why we have so many zombie companies out in the world today. A company like GE, for example, is almost certainly a zombie company that keeps running off of the fact that they are large and not because they are innovating or creating any new goods and services. So those are the current incentives at the company level. So how does Bitcoin change things? Well, first of all, there's no Cantillon effect. There's no money being printed that gets distributed to favored companies. Instead, you have miners, and it costs just as much to produce Bitcoin via mining than it does to actually buy it. So they're not gaining anything. They make a small margin off of whatever efficiencies that they can make, and that means that there's less debt fuel growth. That means that there aren't as large companies. If you think about it, small companies have many advantages over giant companies. They're much more agile. They can try more things, and more importantly, they know what everyone else is doing. In a large company, most of the time, you have very little clue of what most of the people in the company are doing. As a result, there aren't winner take all effects or more monopolies. Instead, you have more competition, leading to better goods and services, and ultimately, it leads to more innovation, more goods and services that are better in some way, shape, or form than the current ones that exist in the market today. And all of that changes as a result of getting rid of fiat money and using Bitcoin instead. All right, so we've looked at the individual and company level. Let's now take a look at the nation level, because at the nation level, things are very different as well. All right, so the first thing to recognize is that a lot of our nations are built around to support the companies that exist already. We've already more or less gone over how central banks are essentially supporting the large companies and do whatever they can to make the big companies even bigger. But think about even something like the education system. The education system essentially takes a very creative human being and churns out a cog for a wheel. Instead of a very creative human child, you get something, a very hyper specialized piece that can fit into a large company, like an accountant or a lawyer or an engineer or something like that. And that's all you get paid for. And they have to run it this way because companies can't hire somebody and then see where they fit and stuff like that, at least not at big companies, because they have specific roles. That's the only way they can really run. They're too large for any one person to know what everyone else is doing, and therefore they need to churn out cogs for the wheel. And this is how education systems in most countries are now made. And finally, regulations and laws, they're more or less made to protect whatever interests that are already existing in large companies and so on. Entire nations have built their laws and laws in order to protect the very companies that are, basically taking advantage of the system that they're in. And this means that the governments and nations have control of money. And there is a giant moral hazard in that control of money, in being able to print their own money, because of the Cantillon effect, and because they have access to the money printer going burr. There's a moral hazard, and that in turn leads to a lot more rent seekers, or people that don't really add anything to a transaction. They sit in between a transaction, don't add anything, and take a cut without doing anything productive. And this cartoon, assistant to the aide of the deputy vice chairman of the committee to reduce Pentagon bureaucracy. This is the classic rent seeker, somebody that doesn't do anything yet collects a check, and that causes friction all throughout the system. And that's what tends to happen when there is a central party that creates money. And as a result, governments tend to be very disconnected from price. Now, I don't know if many of you know about healthcare.gov in the United States, but this was colloquially called Obamacare. And they had a website, healthcare.gov. They paid $700 million. It took 18 months for some firm in Chicago. And when it launched, it crashed. It couldn't handle more than 50 users at a time. Now, Todd Parks, CTO of the United States at the time, went to Silicon Valley, hired a couple of really, really good engineers from Google. They, in turn, hired another 18 or so people. And that group of 20 decided that this website wasn't going to work. And they rebuilt the whole thing from scratch. Now, they took 20 people, took 9 weeks, and it cost $10 million. Think about the difference, 700 million versus 10 million, 18 months versus 9 weeks. You could get it done a lot more efficiently, but they were disconnected from price. So, these software developers in Chicago that did a very poor job managed to get $700 million. It ends up being crony capitalism, which is endemic in most nations. And finally, the thing at the nation level that fiat money changes is that there's a much larger purview and moral imperative. And by that, what I mean is that generally, whenever people have a problem, they start looking to the government for help, because the government can print whatever money they want, right? And we see this very clearly in the current crisis. If you can solve the problem, why aren't you? This is a giant problem, because this is what politics has turned into. It's a game of promises and trying to weasel out of keeping those promises as much as possible. Because as much as government likes to think that they can fix problems, they can't. It's really just taking money from one group of people and giving it to another. It's a redistribution scheme, not fixing anything. So how does Bitcoin fix this? Well, Bitcoin changes the entire system so that it's not about supporting large companies anymore, because they are disconnected from the control of money. And therefore, they become much more connected to price. Governments start becoming a lot more price sensitive, and instead of just spending whatever money willy-nilly. They're restricted by the revenue that they collect in taxes, rather than deficit spending from the money that they are allowed to print through their central bank. And finally, that means that it's a much more limited government. People start expecting less things from government and instead take personal responsibility and control of over their own lives, instead of being more of a nanny state. So that's at the nation level. Let's finally look at the final level, which is the global level. And this is the entire world, basically. And how does this change incentives? Well, first thing to know about the current system is that we are under a dollar hegemony. And everyone in the world, possibly with the exception of some people in the United States, knows that the U.S. has some sort of unfair advantage. They can kind of feel it. They don't know exactly how to verbalize it, but they know it deep down in their soul. And I'm sure many of you watching know this. And the reason is because the dollar, since Bretton Woods in 1944, has been been the settlement currency for international trade. And that means that it has a privileged position. If you want to buy oil anywhere in the world, for example, you more or less have to use the dollar in order to buy large quantities of oil. And that, of course, is the basis of the petrodollar. And that means that the dollar has a global Cantillon effect. That means that everyone in the U.S. gets the benefits of being the first spenders of the U.S. dollar, and third world countries are the last spenders. So they get all of the they benefit the least, or they get screwed out of it, and of course that often leads to hyperinflation. And this is the situation that you see in this picture when fiat money is completely not worth picking up. And this is the real tragedy out of it. The Cantillon effect is pretty bad in the U.S., and you do have to spend a lot of effort in storing and creating, storing rather than creating wealth. But in a third world country, it's much worse. It's actually way worse. For them, like keeping storing wealth in U.S. dollars is considered something really like stable versus their own crappy currency. And that means that there's a lot of people in third world countries, especially, that are spending their time and money storing rather than creating wealth, and that's a huge waste of human capital. It's much worse, and that ends up putting in a cycle of like being on a treadmill and running to stand still, essentially. There's a lot of human capital around the world that doesn't get used very well because they're having to keep up with whatever system that they're in as a result of fiat money. And that means that the whole world ends up being interdependent and fragile. And we can see this in this current crisis with COVID, is that it's a virus that started in China, but it's affected the entire global supply chain, and every economy has either suffered or will suffer significantly as a result of this one thing. And a similar thing happened in 2008. A small problem in the mortgage market in the United States ended up creating a global recession. So there's an interdependence and fragility as a result of the dollar dominance that exists today, and that's an unfortunate part of the reality that we live in as a global society. Now, how does Bitcoin change this? First of all, we get rid of the dollar hegemony, and that means that there's less global Cantillon effects. And instead, it's a much fairer world. And that means that human capital gets spent a lot better. People are using their talents in order to create value rather than trying to preserve what little value they have. And instead of interdependence and fragility, we have independence and anti-fragility. We have a lot smaller states that are trying different things, and collapses that they might have are very much contained within their own borders instead of rippling out and causing everything else to crash at the same time like we're seeing now. So that's at the global level. So ultimately, what I'm saying is that Bitcoin changes incentives in many different ways, and it happens way down at the individual level and way up to the global level. And as a result, we have a much sounder system where there's more personal responsibility, where there's more entrepreneurship, where there's more civilization being built rather than people being concerned with preserving whatever money that they have. And hopefully that creates a world that is much better. It essentially ends up killing fiat. And that's a word that I want to leave you with today. It's Cato the Elder from Roman times used to end all of his speeches with Carthago delenda est, which essentially meant that Carthage must be destroyed because Carthage was the mortal enemy of Rome. As Bitcoiners, I say fiat delenda est. Fiat money must be destroyed. Thank you.
Jimmy Sung. Amazing presentation, my man. Thank you very much. There's 2 cowboys in the house now. We have so many people all over the world that have been joining this event. It's been growing exponentially over the last 48 hours. There are tons of people who are huge fans. Can we throw you a couple of quick questions from our audience?
Absolutely.
Let's do it. All right. I'm just going to randomly go in here. So how often do you actually use Bitcoin in your daily life?
I'm using it every single day to store my value. And that's, I mean, like I said in my presentation, storing value is the killer app. There really aren't very good stores of value. If you try to go get physical gold right now, it is very, very difficult. But if you already have the gold, you're storing value in gold. Similar thing with real estate and stocks. You know, those are the things where people park their money. I'm parking my money in Bitcoin, and that's using it just as much as buying coffee with it. In fact, I think buying coffee with it is a mistake, because all the Bitcoin that I've ever spent, I've regretted, and because Bitcoin continues to rise in price. So yeah, I completely disagree with this notion that using it means like paying for something. If you're storing value, you're using it just as much as you know, a Chinese billionaire is using condo in New York by putting his money in.
Totally fair. I get it too. I can never spend my Bitcoins. All right, let's go into here. What is your favorite shitcoin? Of course, this question has to be asked.
Well, I see shitcoins more or less as fiat money, because they have a centralized point of control. I mean, all of the things that I talked about in my presentation with the Cantillon effect and the early spenders and all the unfairness of being an insider in those kinds of situations apply to shitcoins. And you know, you have something like Ethereum, where, you know, Vitalik decided almost unilaterally to bail out a bunch of people that made a poor decision in investing in the DAO. I mean, that's you know, that's present. That threat is present in every shitcoin other than and because they're all centralized. Bitcoin is decentralized, and that means that this risk doesn't exist, whereas it does in those other ones. So I don't invest in shitcoins, and I think they're a waste of time, and they're more or less fiat 2.0, except, you know, there's no legal tender law forcing you to use like you know, Monero or something like that. So I don't waste my time on those.
Totally fair. Okay, we're going quickly to one last one. I wish we had more time, but we're just rolling and rocking on. I'm randomly going to pick one. What will Bitcoin look like in 10 years' time? Will it be seen as old and maybe some other shitcoins be taking their place?
I think Bitcoin will have, at that time, have lasted 20 years. And most people that are young adults by then will have grown up most of their lives with Bitcoin in the background somewhere, and it'll become a really good store of value. The thing is, like all of these other coins, you know, like they get a new bell or whistle or something like that. I don't think you understand the idea of a Schelling point. Essentially, you know, money is convenient when, you know, a lot of other people accept it, and when a lot of other people see it as a store of value. So, like scarcity is its own network effect. Having an extra bell or whistle doesn't really matter. I read a while ago about the French Revolution. They changed all the month names, and they changed like the number of days in a week to 10 and stuff like that. And they said, this is based on reason. We're going to have 10 days in a week because, you know, 10's like a nice even number, and all this other stuff. And of course, like none of it worked. Like they tried it for a few months and nobody liked it. And essentially, like every other country was on something else. So they, like Napoleon essentially put everybody back onto a 7-day week and normal names for months and so on. And that sort of speaks to like all of these altcoins trying to do something slightly different. It's not about new or old. You actually want something stable. That's the more important thing when it comes to store of value or money. It's not oh, okay, well, I have this new extra feature, but I'm gonna give up decentralization to get it. It's the fact that Bitcoin is politically neutral. It's the only real one that's politically neutral, because every other one has a centralized point, a single point of failure. And as a result, it's a better money than all of these other ones. So in about 10 years, I expect Bitcoin to be the dominant crypto as it is right now, and that it will have much wider adoption, and that the price will be significantly higher.
Jimmy Sung, thank you so much for joining us at BlockDown 2020. You're the man. Everybody else here thinks you're the man. Thank you very much for joining us. I hope to see you at the after party. There's a virtual after party going on. Maybe we'll see you. Hopefully you show up. Thanks so much for your time, man. Stay safe and be good.
Thank you.
Take care. All right, guys, we're going for a quick break, and then we will be right back with our next panel.